On the other hand, scientific facts can be much more complex than that. I define them here simply by saying that they're descriptions of physical phenomena. Now, those descriptions can be highly complex. A claim about the temperature at the center of the sun is a factual claim, but it's not something, hopefully, that any of us have experienced. We don't experience the temperature at the center of the sun, and yet it's a factual claim. On the other hand, theories are attempts to explain why the facts are as they are. All right? It's in a different category. It's not like a theory at some point becomes a fact because it has sufficient evidence supporting it. A theory is an explanation. A fact is a description. Now, when we talk about gravitational phenomena, hardly anybody gets mixed up about this because they're labeled differently due to the history of gravitational phenomena. Kepler, at the beginning of the 17th century, was the astronomer who discovered what we still call Kepler's laws. So I'm going to use an analogy now and refer to something that took place in the history of gravitational theory and relate it to what took place in the history of evolutionary theory. Kepler discovered that the planets don't go around, rather that the sun and the planets don't go around the Earth, but that the planets and the Earth all go around the sun. And furthermore, they don't go around in circles, they go around in elliptical orbits. And furthermore, there are relationships between their periods and their distance from the sun. The cube of their distance from the sun is proportional to the square of their period of rotation, for example. Now, those are not facts that you directly observe, at least unless you're real special. I mean, when you look at Venus, you don't see it going around the sun, and you don't see it going in an elliptical orbit. However, there's enough evidence for those laws so that we accept them as facts. Now, the question in the 17th century was, of course, why did they do that? And Newton developed a theory in the Principia which gave an explanation for why the planets do that. It's Newton's famous law of gravitation, which tells you that if you have an inverse square law operating between two masses, one of which is approximately stationary and the other having a transverse velocity, that the planets will obey what we call Kepler's laws. So it was an explanation, a theoretical explanation for Kepler's laws. All right, fine. So a lot of the subsequent development of gravitational theory, of course, has been the revision of Newton's theory of gravitation. It's no longer the final word as a theory. It's been replaced, in fact. But the fact of Kepler's laws has remained as a basic phenomena of planetary motion. Now, if you look at what goes on in evolutionary theory, or in the history of evolution, there's a problem because the word evolution is used ambiguously. The way I'm going to use it, or I'm not going to use it too much myself, actually. I'm going to use different words because I want you to know what I'm referring to. The fact involved is what is usually referred to as descent with modification. That's the term that Darwin used, or simply common descent, namely the claim that all life is descended from a common ancestor. That includes bananas, turnips, dogs, elephants, etc. It's a factual claim. Now, some of us don't believe it, right? But what I'm getting at is it's in that category. That's the category that it falls into philosophically. It's a factual claim. There's evidence in support of it. I'm going to go over some of it in a minute. But that's what it is. And Newton, or rather Darwin, was the one who for the first time most successfully argued for that fact. Now, what complicates things is that Darwin, of course, also developed a theory to explain why that fact is the case, or how it came to be the case, namely his theory of common descent by means of natural selection. Now, that's why some of the confusion comes in, because Darwin did both of these, and in the case of gravitation, of course, you don't get mixed up because Kepler's name is Kepler and Newton's name is Newton, so there's not a problem. All right, so I'd like to have you keep this distinction in mind, and I want to talk briefly about what is good science and what should be taught, because the evidence in support of common descent is pretty overpowering. There are two basic types of evidence that I want to talk about, because this is just a brief run-through here. First off, the fossil record. What would be absolutely convincing proof that descent with modification, common descent, is absolutely wrong? What would knock that out completely? Well, one type of evidence that would surely do it would be if you went down through the fossil record and you found absolutely the same set of fossils all through the record. You understand what I mean by that? In other words, as we went down through the strata, all the way through, we'd find chimpanzees, human beings, ducks, platypuses, everything the same, all mixed up, all the way down through the strata. Right? If we found that, no one would be bothering talking about any kind of evolution. I mean, it would be ridiculous. That's not what we find, though. As we go down through the strata, this is just the typical sequence that's put in, usually in the inside of college textbooks, showing you all the different formations and some of the fossils that are found in those formations. You don't find fish everywhere. You only find fish at a certain point. Right? So the fossil record, in general, is something that supports descent. Now, let me make a few remarks, and then I want to shift gears on this a little bit. When I say that it supports descent with modification, common descent, that doesn't mean necessarily that every link between every two species or type of animal is present. Of course not. The only absolutely convincing evidence of transitional forms that I have at my fingertips are my wife's 8 brothers. That is absolutely knockout argument of transitional species. You get these guys in a room, and you have no doubt that they are not exactly the same as the rest of us. One of them's name is Dan, but we call him Neanderthal. I mean, this is a clue that we have a transitional form here. But that evidence isn't available to everybody. It's kind of kept in the family. What you do have available are really interesting creatures. I use a book in my class by Philip Johnson called Darwin on Trial. And when the book came out, he claimed that there was absolutely no evidence for how you get from fish to amphibians. And within just a couple years, they start finding interesting things. They start finding fish that have, digits in their fins, the lobe fishes with digits in their fins. They start finding amphibians that have skeletal evidence not only for internal gills, but also lungs and appendages which are too short to support them out of water. So that the hypotheses that people are developing about the transition from fish to amphibians is starting to look like they developed their legs while still living in the water, rather than somehow getting on land and then developing legs there. Now, is this going to convince anybody who can't see my wife's 8 brothers that there are transitional forms? No, because if you're absolutely convinced that there are no such things, it doesn't matter how much evidence there is. But I want to point out something that's kind of interesting about this. Young Earth creationists who are more academically inclined and try to develop models for how this sequence actually could have come about, think about the kinds that were taken on the Ark, on Noah's Ark. Now, how many kinds were there? Well, it's a tough question, but some of the ones that I've read will say something like 6,000 kinds, which means that all the variety of life that we see now had to develop from those 6,000 kinds. Now, when you think about that, you should think about how much variety you have to get out of those 6,000 kinds in such a short time. It seems to me that this is a place where, ironically, you should see cooperation between evolutionary theorists and young Earth creationists, because both are looking for intermediates between the different types of animals in the fossil record. Now, that I haven't seen a lot of things going on like that, cooperation at that level, but it is ironic that both should actually be looking for these kind of transitions, because the old view that God created in the beginning every kind of species, and that's thousands and thousands and thousands of species, doesn't really look too good. How is Noah going to round up every species of beetle and get it on the ark? I mean, that gets kind of ridiculous. So most creationists will say that there are kinds, and the evolutionary development that's taken place since then has simply been varieties within kinds. All right, I want to get off the fossil record, but I do have a couple of questions just issues that I want to bring up. One thing, so far I've just been talking about the relationship of the fossil record to common descent. But what about the relationship of the fossil record to Noah's flood? I mean, on some views, Noah's flood was responsible for the majority of the fossil record. Now, if that's true, how exactly do you locate that event in the fossil record? There are all kinds of questions that are curious about that. One would be, why in some segments of the fossil record you see such uniformity?